The garrison city of Al-Qatifa was the regime's first choice when it came to burying the revolution.
طلق ناري ومطمش عيونه وأحيانا بالزلط يعني عاري.
Around half the city made up of Assad's soldiers and their families, so it afforded the regime near complete silence from the rest of the population about what happened here, until now. Others have reported remotely on the existence of the biggest mass grave in the 21st century using satellite imagery. So we had that and GPS coordinates. Outside the city, we stopped at a petrol station, asked for directions. 50 years of deadly oppression meant at first they weren't forthcoming.
فهموا بالله بعد الرعب فينا.
55 سنة.
We were told to talk to the former mayor of the town, Mohammed Abdel Majid. He started by asking us which mass grave we wanted to see first. Industrial-scale burying of corpses means liaising with the local authority. It takes time, organisation, equipment, and it has to start somewhere. The Shamalia Cemetery, 2012.
حفروا هونيك بالتركس، حفروهم بالتركس، صار يجيبوهم من الباب هون ينزلوهم يدفنوهم هونيك. كله بيعرف كل شيء، ولد بالشارع بيعرف كل شيء، بس ما فيك تعمل شيء، لأنه إذا عملت شيء مصيرك مثله، بكل بساطة. الحمد لله فرجت، الحمد لله فرجت على الأمة. ظلم ونزال. تحبوا تشوفوا الموقع؟
This was the first plot between two headstones. Within that year, half the cemetery became an unmarked grave.
هاي التلة من هون لهون. صورها بالاتجاهات من هون لهون. التلة العالية. يعني هاي الطول شي 20 متر، جابوا تركس حفروها، صار يجيبوا الجثث ويزتوا فيها. بعدين ردموها. طبعا بعد الردم الجثث فسخت، سلتت التربة وصارت تطلع منها روايح.
So this site was sort of ground zero when it comes to the mass graves all around here. So let's start here. How many people do you think are buried underneath this patch of ground?
طبعا نحن يعني بتتوقع على حسب عداد المرات اللي جابوا فيها، كم نقلة جابوا، يعني جابوا برادين 3 10 20، إذا كل مثلا 10 برات كل برات فيها 20 30 في 300 400 توقع، بس ممنوع تشوف.
Back at the mayor's office, we meet Mahmoud Al-Sabah. He was the driver for a more senior local official. His boss's job, forced to liaise with the Syrian Air Force intelligence, one of the most brutal branches of Assad's security operation, to help dispose of the bodies of people taken from prisons and military hospitals. He describes the state of the corpses he saw.
ملتم على عيونه، مطمش على عيونه، بس الضرب هون.
مطمش عليهم هذا حصن
بس هون جسمه ما في شيء نهائيا ابدا. بس هدول اللي بالبرادات يجوا مشكل على ايه مزت. اجي على البيت انا تقول لي، قلت له وين بدي اكل؟ مالي نفس اكل، انا مالي نفس. والله 5 ايام، والله اوقات 6 ايام ما احط المي بتمي. اقسم بالله وقت اشوفها الشوفه. بس مجبورين ندوس على ما فيك تحكي. ما فيك تحكي.
His boss's job, was to coordinate local labourers to work at new sites for mass graves, because the local cemetery was at capacity. The section you can see here without headstones is in fact full of bodies. There was no more room. It was time to scale up. The former mayor brings us to the next place, the mass grave with the largest number of bodies. There's some concern that an area around the site is mined.
So just to be clear, we stay on the hard road, don't go on the side, yeah?
The Russians also had a base here, as did the Iranians. A local fighter checks the edges. From over the wall of the main mass grave site, you can see Russian-supplied communications vehicles inside. The former Mayor Mohammed calls another local man who arrives before we go inside. His name is Isam Saad. He operated the digger used to cover over the bodies. Corpses would arrive in refrigerated lorries owned by the state-owned logistics company, he says. The burial of all these people a state function, like sweeping the streets or providing education.
تجميع ببراد كانوا يجيبوا الجثث ببراد تبع فواكه وخضرة، وكان مكتوب عليه المؤسسة العامة للخزن والتبريد. كان يجي معهم ضابطين عقدة وعناصر ينتشروا بشكل كبير، بس يخلصوا يقولوا لي حط التراب على الجثث.
The dirt inside covered those taken from prisons like Sednaya and dozens of similar smaller facilities, also from military hospitals. This is literally one of the places where the Syrian uprising was buried. And during that time, Isam was called in day after day to cover layer after layer of bodies for 7 years.
How many people do you think are buried in this facility?
تحصرهم تقريبا الرقم شيء تقريبا 150 ألف جثة. حفري.
اكيد هون المتر هون اكيد.
ايه هون. هلا نحن هون اذا جابوا شيء اللي حفروا ببين معنا اذا كان، لانه هون كان ما في عمق، بعدين صاروا يغمقوا. هون
Isam explained that initially the bodies were buried at a depth of 1 meter, but animals scavenged the site. After that, the pits had to be made deeper.
بعدين صاروا يسووه على 3
امتار.
عرفت شلون يحطوه؟
لا
يعني ما عاد تبين جثث.
There are reports that the number of people buried here is much higher than 150,000. But either way,
That is a sizable proportion of the entire number of Syrian people disappeared under Assad's regime. And I simply don't know what else to say, really, about this place.
except this. Here is the true size of this mass grave. And here is exactly what these men saw here, in their own words for the first time. Hard to hear, but needs saying.
أنا شفت مرة سيدة واحدة لابسة بيجامة الرياضة قالوا عنها لاعب جمباز سوري، دفنوها لأنه لفتت نظري إنه عم ينزلوا كانت بعدها بلباس الرياضة. طلب الأطفائية من الطائفة الجثث من كتر ما متجمدة صايرة كتلة واحدة أكثر من 100 جثة، شدوها حاولوا يشدوها ما نزلت. جابوا الأطفائية لحلوا الثلج عنا بالأطفائية البلدية لذابت الثلج عنهم بعدين نزلت الجثث.
As we left, Moaz Mustafa from the Syrian Emergency Task Force arrived. Himself and his team have made exposing what happened here their life's work. It was the first time he'd set foot on the site.
Where are the forensic teams? Where are the governments and the experts that can help us, number one, secure these places, help us understand how do you exhume bodies from mass graves? How do you take DNA samples for the many families still looking for their loved ones, even mine? And my uncle could be underneath my feet right now. My friends could be, and so many others.
A few years ago, the regime moved some bodies from here after Moaz's work and others exposed what was happening. Mass graves don't distinguish between people, that's the point. But this is not one big canvas, one single image. It literally belies the sanctity and individuality of every person buried here. And for their loved ones, this is holy ground.
Porrick O'Brien with that special report. Well, earlier I spoke to Moaz Mustafa, who you saw there briefly in Porrick's piece. I started by asking how certain he was that his uncle was one of those buried in the mass grave of Al-Qataifa. And a warning, our conversation does contain extremely graphic and distressing descriptions of torture.
If he is, and we believe he is, unfortunately, I've searched everywhere in Damascus for him and American citizens and others as well. Qataifa would be where he would have been thrown alongside the hundreds of thousands, frankly, of bodies that have been buried in mass graves by the Assad regime.
What was he arrested for?
Oh, just like every other Syrian, if you do humanitarian work, if you do medical work, if you try to help besieged civilians, that's a much bigger crime in the eyes of the Assad regime than if you carry arms. And my uncle worked very hard to provide ventilators for people in eastern Ghouta, the suburbs of Damascus that were besieged, because he knew, and because he had seen soldiers with gas masks, that gas could be used. He also was someone who would help organize protests and write graffiti on the walls saying, we call for democracy, we call for an end to tyranny.
It's so hard for us to imagine what it's like to have a relative, a loved one, just disappear off the face of the earth.
They didn't just take him. They took my uncle. They took his 1-year-old Omar, his 4-year-old daughter Maria, his 14-year-old daughter Sally, and my aunt, his wife. And I even had sent a female cousin to go check on them. They took her as well. Thank God we were able to get the women and the children out. I went to every place where my uncle could have been. And I went to Saydnaya, where he would have been last. And I was not able to find any evidence of him.
I'm so sorry. I can't imagine what you're going through at the moment. Do you still hold out any hope at all that he might still be found alive?
I know objectively that 99% he's gone. And 99%, that's a high percentage. You know, pretty much let's have a funeral, let's move on, you know, and so on. You cling on to that 0.1% chance. And so it's a weird thing, because I know, and I would be telling somebody else that would have been in my place, listen, he's gone, open a court case, have a funeral, move on. He's in heaven right now watching the liberation of Syria happen from afar. But as a human being, as someone who loves someone else, I still want to cling on to that 0.001% because I don't have a body. And that's the story of so many families.
Do you think there can ever be any form of justice for what happened to your uncle and to so many others?
I believe so. I believe in justice, no matter how long it takes. Look, we're 14 years of war. The world ignored chemical weapons, cluster bombs, barrel bombs, Russian bombardment, torture and rape of men, women, children, literally everyone. And they let it go. But after 14 years, the Syrians liberated themselves without any outside support. And you know, maybe that was for the best. The world should be ashamed of it. But the same thing applies to justice. No matter how long it takes, we will get each one of these people, starting with Bashar Al-Assad, no matter how long it takes.
What happened to your uncle is a deep personal tragedy for you and your family and for his friends. But the scale of the atrocities, the size of these mass graves, 100,000 people perhaps, or more, buried in these pits. That is something truly historic, isn't it?
The scale of these atrocities is not only gigantic, but how they died. Imagine pulling the fingernails out of little babies' hands. Imagine using a drill into people's kneecaps. Imagine taking an elderly man, cutting him open and throwing salt in his wound. That's how these people died. It is a slaughterhouse, a machinery of death, but death in the worst ways possible. And we always say never again. Well, it just happened. Maybe from now we can start with never again. Not just for Syria, but for the rest of the world, for our world order.
Muaz Mustafa, thank you very much for finding the words and the time to speak to us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Stephen Rapp served as the US Ambassador at Large for war crimes issues in the Office of Global Criminal Justice under President Barack Obama. He joins me now from Damascus. Ambassador Rapp, I mean, you heard that searing account there of those mass graves and the need for justice. What has to happen for justice to actually occur at the end of the day?
Well, it was a great report, by the way, and I was out at El Qataifa today to see the same scene. But what needs to be done for justice is that we need to develop the evidence. A lot of it is already developed. To be frank, we'd met many of the grave diggers that were involved in digging this grave and others. We have the Caesar photos. We have more than 4 million pages of documents that have been smuggled out to the West that evidence this crime as it was being committed. But now, of course, we have access to all of the facilities where this crime was planned and executed, literally at 100 sites around the country. And so the key thing now is to secure those documents, digitize them, analyze them, and then, of course, also for the sake of the victims and the survivors, people like Moaz with his uncle, but so many others, is to do everything that we can to develop a program to find those bodies, those remains, match them with DNA that people can provide saliva samples for, and develop that DNA to identify as many of these deceased as possible. But then, of course, we need a court to try these cases. We've got an opportunity now in a new Syria to build a court led by Syrians, for Syrians, but with international assistance so it can follow the lessons that we've learned in other transitional justice practices and processes like I was involved in Rwanda and Sierra Leone.
Right. We know from the authorities that are now taking over in Syria that they are also looking for justice. Are there conversations taking place between people like you, experts from outside, and the new people running Syria in order to make sure that the evidence, especially the forensic evidence, is uncovered safely?
Well, you've certainly laid out the agenda of my trip. I arrived here today and obviously went to this site, and I'll be going to others. But I'm confident that I'll have meetings before I leave here this week in which we'll certainly convey that message, the importance of securing these sites and securing these documents to the maximum extent possible, and then working with international partners to make sure that that evidence is preserved and analyzed. And then as well, we, in consultation with various groups, to develop that process. Obviously, it's up to Syria to decide what it wants to do, but there are ways that can be done that I think will earn the respect of Syrians. Frankly, in this country, they've seen justice so distorted. Right. These courts that were just part of the machinery of death, and they want to see true justice. And we're here, and others will be, to help them accomplish that.
Okay, so we heard earlier from Muaz that he really wants to see not just the henchmen brought to justice, but also the people at the very top of the Assad tree, including Bashar Al-Assad himself, who of course is now taking refuge in Moscow, courtesy of a man, Vladimir Putin, who's got an ICC arrest warrant against him. How likely is it, do you think, that Bashar Al-Assad will ever end up in court?
Well, a whole lot more likely than it was 2 weeks ago. He's been overthrown in his own country. He's in Moscow in sufferance. Moscow has its own interest in its own war criminal and its own conduct in Ukraine. eventually I think pressures can be brought on a variety of countries to bring people to justice. I mean, we never thought we'd get Milosevic. We never thought we'd get Charles Taylor. We never thought we'd get Ratko Mladic. We were able to do that. The first thing is you develop the evidence that's sort of unanswerable, and then establish a court which is following proper procedure. And then the expectation on every country in the world is they need to comply if they're going to get out of sanctions, if they're not going to be in trouble themselves.
All right, going to leave it there. Ambassador Rapp, thank you very much indeed. Now, as Porrick O'Brien reported, mass graves were the final part of a ruthless system of detention and torture operated by the Assad regime for decades. Using both witness testimony from recent days and satellite imagery, Channel 4 News has mapped 90 sites which reveal Assad's vast and heavily coordinated network of brutality. You can watch the latest in our Explainer series on our YouTube channel. Well, so what chance is there of accountability for the Assad regime, given the evidence being uncovered Al-Qataifa and elsewhere in Syria? Our correspondent Paul McNamara joins us from the State Department in Washington, D.C. Paul.
The focus in Washington seems to be what comes next in Syria. Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, has just come back from a frantic round of negotiations in the region. We learned that he's also been talking to HTS. In fact, he's had multiple conversations with HTS in Syria. And what we've been briefed on those conversations is he's been saying to them, look, he wants a transition of power to be peaceful, Syrian-led and inclusive government, and Syria should not be used as a base for terrorism. And while they're not saying it on the record, the mood music from what we're hearing from the State Department is if HTS jump through all of those hoops, then the US may look at recognising them formally, which is important because that unlocks investment for Syria. But there is a big spanner in the works. 5 weeks from now, it won't be the Biden administration, it will be the Trump administration. And Donald Trump has already said he wants the USA to have nothing to do with Syria. Quote, "It's not our fight." Now, look, two things that we know from history with Donald Trump is that, first of all, the rants, the rhetoric they don't always meet reality. And what we also know from his picks for who he wants to come into government afterwards, that one big thing they are worried about is counter-terrorism and the threat of what might happen in Syria spilling out to things happening here. Ultimately, though, whichever administration we are talking about, what they really care about is the future and not spending lots more time, money and lives on chasing justice for what happened in the past.